Welcome to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast, where you can learn and be inspired by real-world examples of how technology is transforming businesses and reshaping industries in a language everyone can understand. Here is your host, Neil C. Hughes.
Welcome back to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast, where I try to make you think differently around technology and all that data that surrounds us every day, whether we're in the office or at home. And for example, in the workplace, we now know we're heading towards hybrid working. Some days in the office, some days at home. But what does that mean for office space? And the reason I bring this up is I recently came across a company called Humanyze, and they've been analysing workplace interactions, over 20 billion interactions to be exact, to see company-wide trends around how work is getting done, and then off the back of that, inform and improve management decisions that can positively impact financial performance and the employee experience. And specifically, one of their core focuses of their analysis is around the impact of working from home and what that has on the workplace. Not to mention HR, digital transformation initiatives, and how all of these collectively can affect the organisational health of a business. So today I'm going to be speaking with the president and co-founder of Humanyze, who's going to share his insights with us. So buckle up and hold on tight as I beam your ears all the way to Boston so I can introduce you to Ben right now. So a massive warm welcome to the show, Ben. Can you tell the listeners a little about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, I'm the co-founder and president of Humanyze, and we're a workplace analytics company that spun off the PhD research that my co-founders and I were doing back at MIT around trying to use data companies just generate as a course of their normal work. Things like email patterns, chat, meeting, even sensor data about the real world, to really understand macro level patterns within organizations, not at the individual level, but really team and higher levels, understanding how collaboration is happening, how does that change over time, and really how that relates to outcomes within companies. I guess we got interested in this because, and I think it's important, because there's really basic questions you can ask of pretty much any organization in the world that they can't answer. Like, how much does management talk to the sales team? Like, nobody knows that. And even how many hours people work, right? And you think about how simple those questions are, but also how critical they are. And then you think about these very large business initiatives that companies do. Right now, obviously, a lot of people and companies planning what's our long-term workplace strategy going to be like. And they're doing that fundamentally without actually understanding how are we working today? How do we want to work? How does that change? And that's really what we're trying to do, again, at a really macro level.
And I think over the last 18 months, those questions are getting more and more frequent, and there's more and more of those questions. Right. And like you said, we don't know the answers, but we are surrounded by data without even realising it. And workplace analytics solutions are a big topic at the moment. But can you set the scene and tell me more about the kind of problems that you can solve for your customers and the kind of technology that makes it all possible? Because I think it's a topic that every boardroom is talking about, but nobody knows too much about.
Yeah, and I think that's why it's a really exciting time, obviously, because with this massive shift to remote work, at least for information workers, more and more of the work that we do is sort of just generating data as a course of our everyday work, right? I mean, if we're on Zoom, we're generating information on who do we communicate with there, and then on chat, and then all these things. And so I think in the past, there was this belief, which probably hasn't been true for something like 25 years, that you actually couldn't get hard answers on some of these questions around organizational health or how people are collaborating. That it's just impossible to understand how siloed the organization is quantitatively. But that's clearly no longer the case. And the idea is that, again, not the content from these systems, right? It's the metadata from these platforms. But what's actually interesting, and maybe a longer topic for a different day, a lot of people assume that things like content of email or conversations is what's really important. And of course, there's huge privacy implications, from all of this, but in particular content. But what was also interesting actually during our PhD work was we originally had that assumption as well, that was really going to matter. And so in more controlled studies, not just in the lab, but also at companies, we basically saw that data honestly had very little predictive power. And beyond that, of course, there's all the ethical implications of that. I think the intuition behind that is that, especially in large organizations, if you get to hundreds or thousands, or some of our customers, I mean, literally hundreds of thousands of people. Imagine, for example, that the executive team only communicates with the product team once a month. Well, the bigger issue is not what do they talk about that one time. The much bigger issue is that they're so siloed that they barely communicate with the product team. And those effects really dominate at large scales and are by far the biggest predictors of, attrition issues, productivity, whatever you want to look at. And so really what we're trying to do is model these networks within companies and how do they change over time? How do they evolve? And really look at distributions of behavior. Again, in a similar way, a lot of people assume that this must mean that you should look at, what does person A do at 2:30 on Tuesday? Or what does your highest performer do? But if your highest performer is so bizarre that, whatever they do is not replicable, right? Then it's great to have them, but ultimately, that's not something you can build a training program on top of. What we do essentially is looking at these distributions. You want to essentially look at, if you do a behavior 10% more, how will that change attrition, or how will that change productivity? But again, that's not about individuals. It's about groups of people. And so we really look at those issues. Obviously now, for our customers and people we're talking to, everyone is focused on this, returning to office, long-term workplace strategy planning, which teams have been most impacted by moving to remote work, which teams should we prioritize first, but then importantly, which teams also do they work with that should come back, in a similar way. But really, if you think about, broadly speaking, any sort of organizational or people decision that companies make, at least in terms of how people work, so processes, what tools we use, workplace design, really everything internally, operationally, that's where these analytics become extremely powerful. I will say that, as companies get more sophisticated, there's more obviously interesting things you can do. It's gotten to a point for us, at least, where we do, at least for information workers, have a globally representative data set, which was very exciting. We got to a point where you could see, we don't have to get too much into the math of it. We got a very exciting a couple of years ago where we got to this point where we saw very stable behavioral distributions in our customers. And so what I do think, at least at first, as companies start using this technology, and not just ours, I'll say this more broadly about workplace analytics, it tends to be very good at calling out where you should focus your attention, right? Where are there likely issues? Now, that doesn't mean there are, right? Because contextually, there could be things that are going on in a part of the company that you just weren't aware of. But that, after you go over that, then you can start to get into, okay, let's try to understand how different collaboration patterns are related to the KPIs we have internally.
And I said a few moments ago how every workplace is surrounded by data. And just to hammer home that point, you guys have been analysing over 20 billion workplace interactions to see company-wide trends around how work gets done, all in order to inform and improve those management decisions that we're talking about here and how they can positively impact performance and employee experience. But do you have any examples or use cases that you could share just to bring that subject to life for listeners and help them understand how it could work in their world?
Sure. And we have an awful lot, and people can, of course, if they're interested, go to our website, look at some. We've written up some pieces in HBR that also go over, I'm admittedly biased, but I think they're actually pretty interesting case studies. I think one of the interesting things is for one of our Asian customers, which is a large Fortune 500 company. They were able to, this is actually over a year ago at this point, start having people back in their offices. Earlier than a lot of folks, at least in the US, since they did a lot better than we did during the pandemic. But there was this question of, okay, which groups should they prioritize to come in first? And essentially looking at these analytics, they saw that the teams that have been most impacted by working from home were actually the engineering team. Their engineering organization, which again, this is a large technology company, obviously a very substantial engineering operation. But it was interesting that if you look at which teams did engineering collaborate with, What had fallen off the most was their collaboration with the sales organization. And they even knew from pre-pandemic that the more their salespeople, their enterprise salespeople, communicated with engineering, the more they sold. It was an extremely strong relationship. You get an R squared of, in their case, it was, over 0.4, which is, for those coming from social science, it's extremely high. And so what they did then is say, all right, we're not just going to have engineering in because they couldn't have full capacity offices. We're actually going to run a test. So what they did is they had some people from engineering and some people from sales come in on the same day, just once a week. And they wanted to see, well, not just did those teams communicate more on that one day a week they were in, but did they communicate more every other day of the week? And what was fascinating is that they did very significantly. Communication was over 20%. I think it was over 25% higher, actually, after they made that change. But you could show that the teams that didn't come in on the same days had significantly less communication with each other. Again, moving forward, and they can relate that to hard sales, right? They're actually doing this. This is, how much is likely to improve our sales numbers over time. What was interesting about it for me was not just that they could be targeted, and now they're rotating all of their sales and engineering people through, globally, on the same days. They're sort of synchronizing their schedules. But that it was really how fast they made that decision. Essentially what they did is send an email on, I believe, a Wednesday. And they said, next week, we'd like you to come in, to some of these teams, subset of teams, we'd like you to come in, this one day next week. Right. And we do that for a couple of weeks. And I think that previously there was this idea that, if you're going to change how people work, you need a 6-month change management exercise to change that strategy. And I think what people have shown during the pandemic is just how resilient they are and how effective they can make really any sort of working conditions. And so if companies can trust that, then that's really where these kind of analytics become really powerful because they're coming in every day. That means we can run a lot of these tests. We can say, we can admit, like, I actually don't know what the right workplace strategy is. I have a hypothesis, but I don't know that it's the right one. And so we're going to test it. And if it doesn't work, then we will see, you would give it time to take effect, but you give it, maybe a couple weeks, maybe a couple months. And then if it doesn't work, say, hey, didn't work. Here's the data about why it didn't work. It didn't, we didn't increase alignment across different teams and doing that quantitatively. We didn't increase exploration. Sort of different teams that don't normally work together, bumping into each other. So we're going to try something else. And that can be really effective, but that can be so much faster than we did previously. And so I think that's really exciting moving forward. And I hope that, from all the negatives that have come from the pandemic, at least that could be one positive around companies being a lot more flexible and a lot faster to make changes and a lot more willing to admit that we don't really know what we're doing when it comes to organizing companies and really that our analytics, not that they'll give you the right answer all the time, right? These are all probabilistic, but that at least you can very quickly see, are you doing the right thing or the wrong thing, and then change.
And the insights you're unlocking from this information is incredible. I think you recently released data on the impact of the pandemic on employees and sentiment around returning to the office. And one of the things that stood out for me from that was that 44% of respondents would prefer not to return to a physical office at all, which surprised me. But was there anything that stood out for you?
I think there's this, the employee sentiment is this huge wild card moving forward, right? Because it's pretty clear that, people have done, just to be very clear, employees have done a great job of, effectively shifting to working from home, right? And that there's, as we look at those numbers, there's a large percentage of people that want to continue doing that. And so then there's this question of what are the things that we've lost working from home generally, right? But again, that's in general, that's on average. Which parts of an organization should continue to work remotely and which shouldn't, right? And I think there's this dichotomy in the report, sort of in the survey data, as well as in the just macro behavioral changes we've seen between individual perception and then what's changed at the company level, right? In that people have been working hard and doing an incredible job. and want to keep working remotely, but that there's this tension because if you look at what's changed behaviorally in terms of how we work, there's been this real reduction in things like weak ties, sort of the people who you don't really directly work with very much, but that really these are the connections that span very different parts of the organization that are related most to innovation, to milestone completion in large projects. And so, if companies are going to try to get people to come back to the office implicitly to create more of these collisions, these random interactions, then it's pretty clear that they need to make a compelling case, right? Because when you have a high number like that, I mean, I don't care how effective you think the office environment is. If you lose 44% of your workforce by forcing them to go into the office, that is not going to make you more productive, right? And so it's very clear that companies are going to have to make a very compelling and transparent case about why we're making certain decisions. It doesn't appear like that's really happening, so I'm pretty concerned for a lot of organizations. But that I just think what's very clear, from this data is that no one knows what's going to happen. No one really knows, like what is this sentiment going to lead to? Does that actually mean that 44% of people will leave companies that have people come in every day? I think that it's plausible, but we don't know. And I think we're really in the midst of this pretty sort of chaotic era, which is somewhat scary, but is also exciting because I think it's very clear that there's not going to be this convergence to a single model of how we work. There's going to be many different models for many different types of work that will change over time. And I think that's very healthy. I think that would have been healthy pre-pandemic, and that certainly will be healthy post-pandemic.
Yeah, it really is. It's fascinating. And of course, we're heading into this hybrid workspace, or a lot of companies are. But is there anything else that you think those findings mean around the kind of impact that remote working on organizations is having across the globe? Is there anything else that you can share on that?
Well, I'm really concerned about the impact of remote work on many types of innovation and milestone attainment. Now, I've got a piece coming out in HBR where we look at not just the internal collaboration data that we have, as you mentioned earlier. I mean, we have tens of billions of data points around how people collaborate, and what that means is that we've been able to see changes in the way that people work over time. And during the pandemic, of course, we've seen very dramatic changes. And as I mentioned, we saw this real reduction in weak ties, which is really concerning. There are certain things we found that were quite positive. One example is people are collaborating a lot more across different levels of the hierarchy. That's gone up by sort of speaking to people on different hierarchical levels, or communicating with them, I should say, has increased by over 20%. So it's quite significant. But again, it tampered. And I think there's reasons for that. Obviously, there's less social cues that say, like, I'm an important executive, right? I have my private office or something. And you don't have that when you're working remotely. I can reach out to you just as easily as I reach out to anyone else. And it seems pretty clear people are comfortable doing that. And so that's a real positive that obviously we hope we continue that. I mean, the question with all this is, all right, is there a way to preserve that and maybe create some of these weak ties that were lost? And in this HBR piece, what we did is looked at actually the video game industry and looked at video game companies that, because some, particularly in Korea and Japan, until literally a few months ago, never moved to a remote work model. People are still coming into the offices because health conditions are better than in the US and Europe. And you can compare those to other video game companies, which video game industries did extremely well during the pandemic. I mean, sales in 2020 were up over 50% compared to 2019, which is insane for an industry as large as that. So financially, they're doing great. They're producing digital goods, so they don't have supply chain issues that would plague a lot of other industries. So really, if any industry was set up for success, it was video games in terms of development, because these knowledge workers should be able to move to work, remote work, more easily than any other industry. And yet, what you saw was that companies that moved to remote work actually saw delays and challenges in development at over 4 times higher levels than they saw pre-pandemic. Now, in contrast to that, companies that didn't move to remote work actually saw half the numbers of delays and challenges they saw pre-pandemic. Right? So clearly like they benefited from this financial boon to that industry from people staying home and playing video games. But that, really what you can see as the cause of that is this degradation of weak ties within organizations. This idea that the fact that we're not connected to as many parts of the organization that we don't work with on a day-to-day basis, but that's how information flows across large numbers of people. That's how you get new ideas. That's how you realize that actually this part of the product that we're building doesn't really work with this other part of the product. That's not really our area, but it's important. And these are things that have fallen through the cracks, and that has real economic consequences. Now, previous theory would have predicted this, but what we're able to show is that the behavioral data that we see coming in from companies actually has already had real economic impact. And that's only going to increase over time. And so that's sort of what I'm really keeping my eye on, is not just that trend and how is that changing, but that also there's this question of, pre-pandemic, you would have said, okay, well, if we want to improve that, we need people in the office probably at least 3-4 days a week. But based on what we've seen from customers, again, especially in Asia, that have moved to other models over the last year and a half, I wonder if that's changed. Like maybe it could be that, hey, once a week is actually enough to create those, or maybe companies that do more offsites, maybe once a month, maybe that's enough. Like I don't know, because it's like it's unclear if the pre-pandemic meta-analyses of all this kind of data are still valid, given that we've all been through this pretty long-term experience of working remotely. So I think it is this very exciting time, and I'm going to be excited to see sort of what data comes in the in the coming months and years.
It is an incredibly exciting time, and I suspect for many business leaders listening to this conversation today all over the world, I think they all collectively feel like we're, I don't know, exploring uncharted waters together. Yes. Almost. But yes. And for those reasons alone, are there any best practices that you could point people in the direction with, or have any thoughts that you can share for leaders planning for teams returning to work and a variety of different working styles? Yeah,
I mean, I think what's exciting is that in some ways there aren't any best practices right now, right? And that no one knows it's going to work. Like anyone, like even if I said, like, I can't tell you what's going to work, honestly, right? But I think I think that's healthy. What I can say is that there's a general idea about how to go about this, right? Ideally. And of course, there are sort of internal, political considerations that have to come into play. At the same time, different teams need to work in different ways. I think that's obvious to anyone who works, but that what that means is that the way that those teams work should be very different, and they should change over time. If you have a team that, maybe has a very routine task they do all the time, right? And if that team hasn't changed very much how they work when they move to remote work, they could probably keep working remotely. But other teams have probably been significantly impacted, and then they probably shouldn't keep working remotely. Right? And so having a varied approach and trying to ground that in data, again, admittedly I'm biased because this is like the work that I do, but I do honestly believe this, that not only is that going to be, you're going to make probably more right decisions, but beyond that, you can also then have much more open discussions with the workforce around what decisions should be made. Because again, you've seen this with some companies that have said, hey, we're coming back to the office, let's say 3 days a week. And then a ton of people in their workforce, a ton of their employees push back and say, hey, this isn't fair. We've been working our butts off. You're just doing this to punish us. And what this is, but if instead they're saying, no, that's not why we're doing this. We're doing this because we see these explicit changes in how we're collaborating. And we believe that coming into the office, say 3 days a week, will improve that. And if it doesn't, right, and then being transparent, right? So we're going to check in on this. And next quarter, we look at the data. It doesn't say what we wanted. We're going to try something else, and we're going to be open. We got it wrong. I think that approach is very, very healthy. Again, you need to build up a certain level of trust in the organization to get there. But I ultimately think companies that can go that route are going to be more successful. And again, it's not about, hey, just do this with your return to work plan and it's going to be good. It's rather saying, consider the data on how work is happening and how that's changing. Share that with employees transparently, use that to plan a varied approach and then evolve that over time. And I think, this might not be news to everyone. And it's certainly easy for me to say. There's a lot of sort of cultural buildup that has to happen there. But again, people have shown that they're extremely resilient. and that you don't need to have elaborate processes to change how we work. So I don't think people need to overthink this at the very least. Like, we can try things, and if we get it wrong, it's going to be okay. We've clearly seen that that's the case.
And if there is anyone, I don't know, a little bit cynical about this kind of stuff, is there anything else you can add about the power of data and how it can be used to for people looking, I don't know, for people looking at for the ROI of any big IT project or any new solution? The first thing they're going to be asking is, how is this going to help with my decisions? How's it going to help with working engagement and collaboration? Is there anything else you can add on that, and how that data can bring all those very tangible business things to life?
I mean, I think for my end, I mean, basic level, like, I hope that, most folks appreciate that, especially when you have, good validated metrics, having more of those helps you make better decisions in general. I mean, that's my approach. But again, I will say, I think they have to be, validated. And certainly we've, written dozens of peer-reviewed papers on every single one of our metrics. So we've done a lot of work on that. And we're very cautious about releasing benchmarks until we had stable distributions. I think that's extremely important. But there's the general principle that this stuff really matters. And at least in our case, we've shown the relationship to outcomes. But I think, generally this is true, right? And I think that, of course, I could talk about, like, why you should use Humanyze, but that everyone has this data, right? Like, just to be clear, like, you have this data. Now, deriving insight from it is challenging, and that's what we do. But you do have this, right? And so I do think that, especially right now, as companies are going to be making really big decisions, it is imperative that you understand what are the implications of those decisions. And you, again, use data at your disposal to help change this. But then I would also say that, again, this data isn't magic, and these algorithms aren't magic, right? Like, we're deriving insight from these things, and we can show what relates to outcomes, but that doesn't guarantee you're going to get the right answer, which is certainly frustrating for people. But that it's all about probability, right? I think we've all in the past pretended that we knew that, this new headquarters is going to make us more productive, or that this new process is actually the right one for us. But that's a lie, right? It's a hypothesis, and it's okay to admit that, right? But that if we can admit that, then we can, when it's wrong, we can much more easily change it. And I think that data is extremely helpful in that, because without data, it is very hard to subjectively figure out, when is something going wrong. And that beyond that, a lot of the things that have changed about working remotely, are things that are very hard for people to subjectively see. This idea that if week ties have changed, and they've been reduced very significantly by over 20%. Well, the difference in that in your workplace, like work to week. I mean, again, these are people you spend very little time with on a given week. You're talking about changing how maybe 30 minutes of your 40-hour work week went, right? So maybe you communicated with someone, for 5 minutes once every 2 weeks pre-pandemic, and now it's 5 minutes once every 2 months. You don't feel that, honestly, as an individual. You barely feel that. These aren't people you work with very closely, but that has profound implications for how the organization is functioning. And so that's really where workplace analytics can be helpful, surfacing these things that fall below human perception, but are still extremely important. And it's not to say human perception doesn't matter, but it's combining that contextual subjective knowledge with the sort of quantitative behavioral data that workplace analytics can provide is really what I think can take companies to that next level.
And it is such a hot topic right now, and there's got a lot of businesses going to make those big decisions you've just talked about there. So I suspect you guys might be getting very busy. But what's next for you? What's your big focus for the rest of the year?
I think there's been a lot, obviously, certainly lots of companies come to us, which has been exciting, especially around this returning to the office. I mean, I think what is really interesting, over this year is I'm excited to see sort of these very different workplace models that are coming out. I mean, I think, again, pre-pandemic, there was just convergence to really, let's say, a tech company type model of workplace, and that's been blown up. I think that's very healthy. But I think that, as we get more and more data, I think we're going to see more and more variety in how people work and how collaboration is happening. I think that's going to be very exciting to look at. In addition to all just the different data sources, that we've been able to get around how work happens. Again, beyond things like email and chat, that you look at different tools that people use internally to collaborate, whether that's, things like Jira, Salesforce, Slack, but that then you even look at, in-office sensor data as people start coming back around how face-to-face collaboration changed. And there's more and more sensors in office buildings. You can look at that data. That's always really exciting because that's extremely important. But then in the past was maybe harder to get. So I think it's going to be interesting to see that coming in as well.
Well, I've loved chatting with you today, but before I'm going to let you go, I'm going to throw a slight curveball in your direction because we have a Spotify playlist for this podcast where I ask a tech leader every day to share a song or piece of music that means something to them, that has accompanied them throughout their career or just helps them get their head in the zone before going into that big meeting or delivering a keynote speech. Is there a particular song that springs to mind for you, and is there a story behind that choice?
Okay, I'll tell you a song. So I'll tell you a little story behind it too. So I've lived in Japan for a while over the course of my life, and I speak Japanese. And so there's this song by a Japanese band called Rip Slime, Rip SLYME, called Stairs. Right. And it's so basically it's a song about sort of moving forward in life, and it's sort of like climbing up a mountain essentially. But it's always helped me focus and sort of relax, because actually when my first child was born, they wouldn't sleep unless we were holding them for the first 3 months. It was extremely challenging. But what happened is when I played this song, when I played Stairs by Rip Slime, and I sort of danced to it as I was holding them, they would fall asleep within 5 minutes. I might have to go through the song once or maybe 2 times, but they would always fall asleep. And so I always think back to that when I hear that song. It's a good one, even if you don't know the words. It's a very good song. I can tell you it works very well on babies. I've used it with my not even my kids, but with my my baby niece who was born a few months ago, and it worked on her too. So as a parent, I highly recommend it. I don't know what it is about that song. It's enjoyable, but it's good for that as well.
I can hear parents all over the world searching for that song as we speak. Well, I'll add that to the playlist. I'm interested to listen to it myself. Usually when people give me a song, I know it instantly, so I'm intrigued. I'm going to be checking it out for myself.
Okay.
But, before I let you go, for anyone listening wants to find out more information about the work that you're doing, some of those case studies we talked about, what's the best starting point?
Yeah, you should go to humanyze.com. It's humanyze.com, and we've got everything on there.
Well, like I said a few moments ago, just love chatting with you. Every workplace is surrounded by so much data, and that stat around you guys analysing workplace interactions, I think it was over 20 billion of them, is just incredible. And the insights that come out of that, I think businesses are just starting to wake up to it. But more than anything, just thank you for sharing your story with me today, and of course, how to get babies asleep quick as well. It's a bonus, an Easter egg almost at the end there. But thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Neil.
There were so many great stats that Ben shared with us today. Most notably, 44% of their respondents preferred not to return to the physical office at all. And 31% said they would leave their company and look for other employment if they are forced to return to a physical office every day. But if we drill a little bit deeper, things get even more intriguing, because 70% of people would like to prioritise going into an office when their teammates are there. And 73% said that not being able to collaborate with their colleagues in person is their biggest challenge. But sadly, 46% are not confident that their company has thought about this and have that thought out strategy surrounding the return to the office. So it's clear what needs to happen now. But I'm curious, does this reflect what you're seeing in your business and your organisation? And what are you doing about it? What would you like to happen? What have you tried and hasn't worked, and what does work? Please, I invite you to share your insights and experiences, questions, pictures to come on the show by simply emailing me, techblogwriter@outlook.com, Twitter @NeilCHughes, and my website is techblogwriter.co.uk. So much food for thought in today's interview, especially with more and more sensors gathering data both inside and outside of the workplace. Incredibly intriguing where it's all heading. So keep your messages coming in. I'll return again tomorrow with another guest, and a big thank you for listening. And until next time, don't be a stranger.
Thank you for listening to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast with Neil C. Hughes. Remember, technology works best when it brings people together.